Dad realizes his daughter is actually the killer. The room was dark, save for the flickering light from the old lamp in the corner. A faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. He sat there, motionless, eyes fixed on his daughter, who was sitting across from him, her face calm and unreadable. Her soft humming filled the silence. It was a song she used to sing when she was little. His heart raced as he tried to push away the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. Something was wrong, something he couldn't quite grasp. The police had come earlier that day, questioning them both about the murder. They'd found a body in the woods, lifeless, eyes wide open in terror. It was a man he recognized, a man who had always been nice to them. The police had been kind, gentle even, but the questions were pointed, digging into the deepest corners of his mind. And now, as he stared at his daughter, a sudden realization hit him like a cold wave. Her eyes, they weren't innocent anymore. They held a darkness that he hadn't noticed before. It was the way she looked at him. Too calm, too knowing. His hand trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. He remembered the night of the murder, the phone call, the silence, the eerie calm that had followed her return home. A rush of images flooded his mind. The blood on her clothes that night, the way she had smiled when he asked where she had been. Her excuse? A walk in the park. But he knew the truth now. His throat tightened as he felt the cold sweat on his neck. He wasn't sure how long he had been staring at her, but it felt like an eternity. She hadn't changed. No, it wasn't her appearance. It was the emptiness in her gaze. He felt the weight of the truth slowly sinking in, crushing him. She was the killer, his daughter. And just as that realization took root, she looked at him. Her smile, faint but chilling, never wavered. "Don't worry, Dad," she whispered softly. "I'll make sure nothing ever happens to you." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The silence between them felt like a suffocating force. His breath caught in his chest. His daughter, the killer. It was all too much. Everything he knew, everything he believed, had shattered in that single moment. The world outside had faded away. It was just the two of them now. And nothing would ever be the same. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an oppressive weight. His mind raced, but his body remained frozen, as if his own limbs refused to move. She didn't break eye contact. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. The faintest curve of her lips never faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind screamed for answers, for something, anything to make sense of this. "How?" he finally whispered. The word barely escaped his lips, thick with disbelief. She tilted her head slightly, the motion almost tender, as if she were explaining something simple, something he should have already known. "How?" he repeated, louder now, his voice tinged with panic. Her voice, soft but chilling, cut through the tension. "It was easy, Dad. You always told me to protect our family, to do whatever it takes." His heart skipped a beat. The words sank into him like a knife. "That man, he hurt Mom. He hurt us both," she continued, her eyes darkening. "He deserved to die." The weight of her words settled in the room like a suffocating fog. She spoke with such calm conviction, as if she had done nothing wrong. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his body remained rooted in place, as if trapped in the stillness of her gaze. The room seemed to shrink around him. The walls closed in, and the sound of his own breath grew deafening. "How many?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. She blinked, as if considering the question. "A few," she said matter-of-factly. "Just the ones who deserved it." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. His mind swirled, torn between the daughter he once knew and the monster she had become. I didn't raise you like this," he stammered, his voice cracking. He searched her face for any hint of remorse, any trace of the girl he once held in his arms. But there was nothing, nothing but emptiness. She stood up slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. Every step echoed in the silence of the room. "You did, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "You taught me to protect what's ours." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps fading as she left him alone in the darkness of his own shattered world. The door clicked shut behind her, and in that moment, Everything he thought he knew about family, love, and justice was gone. He was left alone with the cold, harsh truth. His daughter the killer. And nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room felt unbearable now, like a weight pressing against his chest. His heart hammered in his ears, each beat echoing the truth he had just uncovered. He tried to move, but his legs felt like stone, immovable, frozen in time. The world outside felt distant, as if the house, the air, everything around him had been swallowed by a deep, inescapable void. He reached for the lamp on the table, his hand trembling as he switched it off. Darkness enveloped the room, and in the blackness, memories flooded his mind. Her first steps, her first words, the laughter they shared. All of it now seemed like a lie, a facade that had crumbled into dust. He closed his eyes, but it didn't matter. Every inch of his being screamed for answers, but there were none. Only questions that would never be answered. Was she always this way? Had he failed her without even knowing? The house felt different now. The walls, once comforting, now felt cold and suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of the secret that now lay between them. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He had to face it, face what she had become. As he walked to the window, his fingers brushed against the cold glass. Outside, the night seemed normal, peaceful, almost serene. But inside, everything had shattered. The world hadn't changed. But he had. His daughter had killed, and it was too late to undo what had been done. The shock was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The truth was now a part of him, as much a part of the family as she was. He was a father to a murderer, and there was no going back. The quiet hum of the streetlights outside filtered through the window, but it brought him no comfort. It only reminded him that he was trapped in his own house, in his own mind, with a daughter he could no longer recognize. Was there still a way to save her? Or had she crossed a line that could never be erased? The questions would linger, unanswered, just as the haunting silence did. And as he stood there in the dark, the weight of his realization pressing down on him, he understood one thing. Nothing would ever be the same. The stillness in the house was deafening, the quiet now suffocating. His thoughts spun in endless circles, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Not anymore. His daughter was gone, and though he had tried to convince himself that maybe she could be saved, the truth was undeniable. The seed had been planted long ago. The sound of a car door slamming outside startled him. He turned toward the window, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was no one there. The darkness seemed to stretch farther now, as if the world outside had vanished altogether. It was just him and the suffocating truth. He glanced at the clock. Minutes, maybe hours, had passed since she left. Time had become irrelevant. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair, trying to grasp some shred of reality. But there was nothing left to hold on to. He sat back down in the same chair he had been in earlier, staring at the empty space where his daughter had sat. The smell of coffee, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien to him. How could he have not seen it? How could he have missed the darkness lurking beneath her gentle exterior? The thoughts kept coming, one after another, relentless and overwhelming. Each one a dagger, twisting deeper into him. What did this mean for him? For their family? What would happen if the police found out? His mind wandered to the details of the crime scene. The lifeless body, the terror in the man's eyes. He had seen it in the report, heard the details from the officers. But now it wasn't just some stranger's death. It was someone they had both known, someone who had been a part of their lives. A knot formed in his stomach as he realized the man had been the one to help her when she was younger. The man who had given her a kind word when she had needed it most. And now he was gone. He had no answers. Only a daughter who had taken a life, and a father who didn't know how to face it. The silence dragged on, thick and suffocating. His world had been reduced to this moment, this unbearable realization. A sudden sound at the door broke the stillness, soft footsteps. He didn't have to turn around to know it was her. Her presence was undeniable, like a shadow that never left. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked, her voice cool and composed. He didn't answer. He couldn't. She stepped into the room, her figure emerging from the dark. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment, he saw something else, something that resembled remorse. But it was fleeting. "Don't worry," she said softly, almost as if reading his thoughts. "I'll take care of everything. I promise." Her words were soothing, but they only deepened the pit in his stomach. There was no escaping the truth now. He looked at her, his daughter, the killer, and all he could do was stare. He couldn't protect her. Not from herself. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The child he had loved, the child he had raised, was gone, and in her place stood a stranger. The silence stretched again, unbearable and long. And as he sat there, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, he knew one thing. This was the beginning of something far darker, and there was no turning back. The weight of his realization hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as he sat in the chair, motionless. She stood there, still as a statue, her gaze never leaving his. For a moment, the room seemed to spin around him, and he fought the urge to close his eyes, to retreat into some distant corner of his mind. But there was no escape. "Don't look at me like that," she said, her voice colder now, sharper. He didn't respond. It wasn't just the coldness in her voice. It was the emptiness in her eyes. Once those eyes had been full of curiosity, innocence, wonder. But now, they were devoid of everything he had ever known. "I did what had to be done," she continued, her words hanging in the air like a chill. "He was a threat, Dad. You should understand that. He was always going to hurt us again." His pulse raced, the walls closing in, each breath more difficult to take than the last. His mouth went dry as he tried to process her words, but they made no sense. His daughter, she couldn't be capable of such things. It was impossible. Yet, here she was standing in front of him, her actions weighing heavy on his soul. But why? His voice cracked, barely a whisper, pleading for some kind of explanation, some trace of humanity to surface. She tilted her head, her expression still unreadable. "Why not?" she asked, almost as if it were the simplest question in the world. "He was always the problem, Dad. You never saw it. But I did." The words hit him like a slap. A cold, sharp realization that there was no turning back from this twisted reality. "I couldn't let him hurt you," she added, her tone softening for just a fraction of a second, but it didn't ease the dread pooling in his chest. She didn't regret it. Not even a little. He stood up suddenly, his legs shaky, his breath ragged. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of fear and anger. "You've crossed a line you can't uncross. You killed him." She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem moved. Instead, she took a slow step toward him, her eyes fixed firmly on his. "Don't you get it, Dad?" Her voice was eerily calm now. "I did it because I love you. Because you're the only thing that matters. You and Mom. Everything else, it's irrelevant." His chest tightened, the room closing in on him as if the walls themselves were pressing in, urging him to see the truth for what it was. It wasn't just the man who was dead. It was the girl he had known, the daughter he had raised. She was gone, and in her place, something darker had taken root. His legs gave out beneath him, and he sank back into the chair, his mind spiraling into a storm of confusion and fear. But she remained standing, unwavering. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her eyes glinting with a strange mixture of affection and something far darker. "But you don't need to worry. I'll protect you. Always." And in that moment, as he looked into her eyes, those cold, empty eyes, he realized with gut-wrenching certainty. His daughter was lost to him forever, and in her place stood something unrecognizable, something he could never save. The house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt like a tomb, sealed off from the world. And he was trapped inside, alone with his nightmare.
The silence that followed her words was deafening, a stillness so thick it seemed to press against him from all sides. He could feel the walls closing in, his breath shallow, his chest tight with dread. Everything he thought he knew about family, about love, about right and wrong, everything was slipping through his fingers like sand. The daughter he had cherished, protected, loved, she was gone. In her place was someone who wore her face, but that's all it was. A face. His pulse thudded in his ears, each beat like a drum of impending doom. He had to say something, do something, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, but only a hollow, empty sound escaped. She took a step closer, her presence now looming over him. Her gaze never wavered, as if she were observing an insect trapped beneath glass. "Dad," she said softly, almost tenderly, "you're scared. I can see it." She was right. He was terrified. Terrified of what she had become. Terrified of the person she had always been and yet had never been. Hidden behind innocent eyes, a sweet smile. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him. She crouched in front of him now, her face inches from his. He could feel her breath on his skin, cool and steady. "I didn't want to hurt you, Dad," she whispered, as if consoling him. "But I had no choice." The words sliced through him. They left him cold, hollow. The love he had for her, the deep affection and pride that once filled him, now felt like a distant memory. "You're my world," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll do anything to keep you safe. I've always wanted to keep you safe." Her hand reached out, brushing a strand of his hair from his forehead, a gesture so familiar, yet so utterly wrong. His mind screamed for clarity, for understanding. How had she become this? How had it all gone so terribly wrong? But all he could do was stare into her eyes, the eyes of a stranger, a killer. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the weight of the unspeakable truth. "I'm sorry, Dad," she repeated, her tone barely more than a breath. "I really am." And with that, she stood up, stepping back into the shadows. For a moment, all was still. Her words, her presence, all hung in the air like a ghost, refusing to leave. Then she turned and walked toward the door. The click of the doorknob was the final punctuation to this horrifying chapter of his life. He tried to speak again, to call out to her, to make her understand, but his voice faltered. The door swung open, and she stepped out into the hallway, leaving him in the silence of the room. He was alone now, alone with the truth. He sat there, frozen, as the weight of his daughter's actions finally sank in. There would be no coming back from this. The door closed quietly behind her, and for the first time, the house felt empty. The silence was oppressive now, more suffocating than ever before. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the crushing realization that the daughter he had raised, the one he had vowed to protect, was a stranger. He sat in the chair, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for some sign, some movement, some hope that this could all be undone. But there was nothing, only the stillness. He stared at the spot where she had been standing moments ago, as if expecting her to return, to explain herself, to take it all back. But deep down, he knew better. She was gone. The daughter he had known was lost to him forever. And in her place stood someone who had crossed a line so far beyond redemption that he couldn't even comprehend it. The thoughts swirled in his head, each one more jarring than the last. What had happened to her? How had it come to this? The man she had killed, he had been someone she trusted, someone who had once been kind to her. Yet, she had killed him without hesitation, without remorse. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms as his mind raced through the images, the blood, the coldness in her eyes, the calmness in her voice. He had been blind, blind to the monster she had become. The house felt more like a tomb now, its walls closing in, pressing against him, suffocating him with a truth he could no longer escape. He stood up suddenly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He needed to do something. He had to confront it. But the fear paralyzed him. He walked to the window and looked out into the night, the darkness now reflecting the abyss inside him. The lights from the street outside cast long shadows across the room, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost hear her voice again, soft, comforting.
But it was a lie.
She was a killer, and there was nothing he could do to change that. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the magnitude of his situation settled over him. She was out there, somewhere, continuing her path of destruction, and he had no idea what she might do next. But one thing was certain, He couldn't protect her anymore. He couldn't protect anyone. As the minutes ticked by, the quiet felt deafening. Every second stretched into eternity. And in the pit of his stomach, the gnawing feeling grew, an emptiness so profound that it threatened to consume him. He glanced back at the door, half expecting it to swing open, half hoping it wouldn't. But it remained shut. His daughter was gone. And he was left to grapple with the terrifying, irreversible truth. He was alone in this nightmare. The house was silent. And he was trapped, locked in a world where everything he had believed in had turned to ash. The weight of the silence felt heavier now, as though the very air was pressing in on him from all sides. He stood at the window, staring into the darkness, his mind numb, unable to process what had just happened. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, fragments of memories, fleeting images, and cold, harsh truths crashing into one another. He had failed her. He had failed to see what was hidden beneath her smile, beneath the innocence he thought he knew. Each time he had comforted her, each time he had held her, told her everything would be all right, it felt like a cruel joke now. The person he had loved had never existed. The door behind him creaked open. He stiffened, but didn't turn around. It was her. He didn't need to look to know it. She walked into the room, the sound of her footsteps too quiet, too deliberate. He could feel her presence behind him, the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him further. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but somehow final, as if she had already made her peace with what had happened. He didn't speak. His throat felt tight, as though his words had been stolen. She continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "I know you're afraid of me now." Her words cut through him like a blade. "I know you're disappointed." She paused, and the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "But you don't need to be," she whispered. He felt a chill run down his spine. He turned slowly, forcing himself to meet her gaze. Her face was the same, but the eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were a stark reminder of everything he had lost. "I did it for you," she said, almost pleading now, but it was too late for apologies. "Everything I did, it was to protect you." Her words rang hollow in his ears. He couldn't respond. The words wouldn't come. The man she had killed, the blood on her hands, it was all too much. He wanted to scream, to tear the world apart, but all he could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, watching the daughter he once knew slip further away. "Do you understand, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't answer. His heart ached, a deep, aching void where love had once lived. He wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew that would be a lie. And for the first time, he realized there was no coming back from this. There would be no healing, no forgiveness. His daughter had killed, and he was powerless to stop her. The truth had shattered everything. And in its wake, there was only silence. His world had crumbled, and he was left standing in the ruins, unsure of who he was anymore. What was left to do but to accept the impossible? She was a killer, and he was her father. And in this broken house, they were both trapped in a nightmare with no way out.
The silence between them grew even thicker, suffocating, as if the air itself had become a prison. He stood frozen, his eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if this was all just some cruel, waking dream. But the sharp sting of reality hit him with the weight of 1,000 truths. This wasn't a dream. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood. And she had become something unrecognizable. "I don't want to lose you, Dad," she said, her voice soft, almost tender, but there was no warmth in it. Her words sounded rehearsed, like she had said them to herself 1,000 times, convincing herself that it was okay, that everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine. None of this was fine. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her how much he loved her, to beg her to stop, to take it all back, but the words were stuck, tangled in his throat. His heart hammered in his chest, his pulse quickening, but nothing he could say would undo what had been done. The guilt crushed him, suffocating him from the inside out. He had failed. He had failed as a father. He had failed to protect her from whatever darkness had taken root in her. "I never wanted you to know," she said, breaking through his thoughts, her voice cracking just slightly. "I never wanted you to see me like this." His chest tightened. The look on her face, desperation mixed with an odd sense of finality, was too much for him to bear. But the truth hung in the air like a noose. She had killed, and nothing could change that. "Please," he whispered, the word escaping him in a broken breath. "Please just leave. Leave me with this," he choked out. Her expression shifted slightly, not with anger or sadness, but with something colder, something almost resigned. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," she said, her voice low and even. "I'm not leaving you. Not after everything." His heart sank even further. Her hand reached out, but this time he recoiled instinctively, a gut-wrenching mixture of fear and disgust coursing through him. "Don't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please don't." She froze, her hand suspended in the air for a moment before it slowly dropped to her side. And then, just like that, she turned and walked away. Each step was like a hammer, striking the last pieces of his hope, shattering them into dust. He listened to her retreating footsteps, each one heavier than the last, until the sound faded into nothing. And then nothing. Silence. An unbearable stillness settled into the room, heavier than any sound. He was alone, alone with his guilt, alone with the truth. His daughter had left him, but she had taken everything with her. He sank to his knees, his hands pressed to his face, the tears finally spilling over, hot and bitter. He couldn't stop them. He couldn't stop the grief, the horror, the overwhelming sense of loss. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. He had no one left. Not her. Not anyone. And the world outside that door felt colder, darker, farther away than ever before. The tears blurred his vision. But even through the haze, the cold reality of his situation remained sharp and unforgiving. He had lost his daughter, but he had also lost himself. The person he had been, the father who believed in second chances and redemption, seemed like a distant memory. Now, there was only a broken man, sitting in the middle of a room that felt as empty as his heart. Tom felt like it had stopped. There were no comforting sounds of life around him. No hum of the refrigerator, no murmur of traffic outside, no laughter or footsteps echoing through the house. Just silence, and the terrible knowledge that he was the one who had failed her. His mind kept replaying the same scenes. The blood, the coldness in her eyes, the calmness with which she spoke of murder, of protection. She had done this, and she had justified it. And somehow, in her twisted mind, she thought she was saving him. "Save me," he whispered under his breath, a hollow, desperate plea. But there was no answer. No one would come to rescue him. He had created this monster with his own neglect, his own blindness. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a car engine starting outside. He barely registered it at first, too lost in the storm inside his mind. But then it hit him. She was leaving. She was really leaving him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His legs moved on their own as he stumbled toward the door. The room seemed to spin as he reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling, but he paused just before opening it. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, trying to steady himself. But he knew, deep down, that no matter what he did, no matter how many times he begged for her to come back, she had already made her decision. The daughter he had known was gone, and in her place stood something far more dangerous, something beyond his understanding. He couldn't protect her. He couldn't save her. But he could save himself, if he was willing to face the consequences of his own inaction. With a heavy heart and a mind that screamed for clarity, he finally turned away from the door. There was no running from this. There was no escaping the reality he had created. He was alone now, and the world outside, with its illusions of normalcy, seemed farther away than ever before. As he sat back down in the chair, his hands still trembling, he realized with sickening certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. His daughter had left, but the nightmare would linger, haunting him forever. And all he could do was wait. He sat in the chair, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. The silence in the house was suffocating. Every breath, he took seemed to draw him deeper into the abyss. His heart felt as if it had been hollowed out, a cavern of emptiness where love and hope once lived. The room around him was unchanged, but it felt different now, darkened, unfamiliar. The shadows seemed longer, creeping into every corner, as if the house itself had transformed into something sinister. It was as if the walls knew what had happened and were closing in on him in judgment. His mind raced, replaying everything, the warnings he had ignored, the moments of doubt he had pushed away. How had it come to this? How had the daughter he had cherished become the thing he feared most? He couldn't escape it. He couldn't outrun the truth. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder now, each second stretching on endlessly. Every tick felt like a reminder of time lost, of opportunities to intervene that had slipped through his fingers. He wondered if he had ever truly known her, if the person he had loved so deeply was always just a mask, a carefully constructed illusion. The thought made him shudder, and for the first time, he wondered if he had failed her long before the murder had happened. Had he missed the signs? Had he been too wrapped up in his own life to see what was happening to her? His hands gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles white from the pressure. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from the empty air. But he knew there were no answers, no absolution. Just the cold, unforgiving reality of what she had become. The house felt like it was closing in around him, and yet he couldn't leave. Not yet. He couldn't face the world outside, not with this weight pressing down on him. What would he even say to anyone? How could he explain the unexplainable? There was no one who could understand. His family, his friends, none of them would ever look at him the same way again. He had failed as a father, failed to see the darkness that had taken root in his own home. The door creaked open again, but this time, it wasn't his daughter. It was the wind, howling through the cracked window. It sent a chill through him, as if the night itself had reached inside to remind him of the terror that was now his reality. The house had become a tomb, a prison of his own making, and all he could do was wait. Wait for what? For her to come back? For the police to knock on the door, telling him everything was over? He didn't know. All he knew was that his world had been shattered. And in the silence that followed, there was nothing left to do but sit there, alone with his thoughts, with his failure, and with the haunting truth that his daughter had become a killer. And he had been the one who had let it happen. The wind howled louder, rattling the window pane, as if mocking his isolation. It was a constant reminder of how small and powerless he felt now. Each gust of air seemed to strip away what little courage he had left, leaving him exposed and raw. The house, which had once been a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a cold, empty shell. The walls seemed to close in, pushing him further into despair. How had he not seen the signs? How had he missed the quiet shifts in her behavior, the subtle changes that could have been warning bells? He wanted to scream, to let out the anger and the confusion, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sank deeper into the chair, his shoulders slumped, defeated. He was drowning in guilt, and there was no lifeline in sight. The clock ticked on, each second like a dagger in his chest. Time felt like an enemy now, every passing moment reminding him of his failure. His fingers pressed against his temples, trying to ward off the oncoming headache, but nothing could erase the image of his daughter's cold eyes. The girl he had loved, the girl he had raised. And yet, somehow, she had become something monstrous. The door creaked again, but this time he didn't flinch. It wasn't her. It wasn't anyone. Just the house, groaning under the weight of its own history. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise of his thoughts. But it was impossible. The image of her standing there, so calm, so detached, telling him that everything she had done for him, was burned into his mind. How could she think that? How could she justify what she had done? Had he been that blind? Had he failed her in a way he could never take back? His mind spiraled further, and in that moment, he realized there was no escape. The past was gone, and the future seemed like a cruel joke. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, the minutes slipping by unnoticed, but eventually, something broke through the haze of his thoughts. The sound of tires crunching on gravel. A car pulling into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be her? He rose slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and shuffled toward the window. He peered through the blinds, but there was no sign of her. Instead, two figures stood by the car, one of them speaking in hushed tones. He couldn't make out the words, but their presence was enough. The police. They had come for him. He knew it was only a matter of time. His stomach twisted in knots, and his throat felt tight. This was it. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. He had to face the consequences of his inaction. As he turned away from the window, the full weight of what had happened crashed over him once again. His daughter was gone, lost to whatever darkness had consumed her. And now, he was left alone with the wreckage of his own choices. The knock on the door came just a moment later, sharp and authoritative. He stood frozen, the cold sweat on his brow, his heart racing. This was the moment he had been dreading. The moment when everything he had known, everything he had loved, would be torn apart. With a deep breath, he walked toward the door. There was no turning back now. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the weight of the moment almost too much to bear. The knock came again, louder this time, a stark reminder that there was no escape from the truth anymore. With a slow exhale, he opened the door. Two police officers stood on the other side, their faces serious and unreadable. The one on the left, a tall man with dark eyes, spoke first. "Are you Mr. Reynolds?" His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension to it. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible, betraying the fear and guilt that had settled in his chest. "We need to talk," the officer continued, his gaze never leaving him. The other officer stood quietly, watching him intently, as if waiting for him to crumble. He nodded, stepping aside, allowing them into the house. The air felt colder as they stepped over the threshold, as if their presence had sucked the warmth out of the room. He led them into the living room, his steps heavy, each one echoing in the silence of the house. They sat down, the officers on the couch, him in a chair across from them. The tension in the room was suffocating, each second stretching on forever. "Do you know why we're here, Mr. Reynolds?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment he couldn't respond. His throat felt dry, as if his words had been stolen from him. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "I have an idea." The officer nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "We receive an anonymous tip," he said, his tone casual, almost too calm, "that your daughter might be involved in something serious." His heart skipped a beat, and the room seemed to spin. The weight of the words felt like a physical blow. She's gone," he whispered, his voice breaking. The officers exchanged a glance, then looked back at him. "We're aware," the first officer said, his tone firm now. "But we need to understand what happened, Mr. Reynolds. We need to know what you know." He felt the walls close in again, the crushing weight of everything he had been avoiding. What could he say? How could he explain the unexplainable? His mind raced, searching for the right words, but they wouldn't come. Instead, all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. She's my daughter," he finally managed, his voice hoarse and raw. I didn't know what she had become." The officers remained silent, watching him, waiting. He could feel their eyes on him, dissecting him, looking for the cracks in his story. I failed her," he whispered, more to himself than to them. "I failed as a father." The room fell into a heavy silence once more. The officers exchanged a look, then the tall one spoke again. "We understand this is hard, Mr. Reynolds," he said, his voice gentler now. "But we need your help. There are things we need to understand about her involvement in the crime." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The truth was spilling out now, and there was no stopping it. But even as the words escaped him, he realized that nothing could change the fact that his daughter was lost. The path ahead was unclear, but the reality was undeniable. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and he was left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the choices that had led to this moment. With a final glance at the officers, he nodded, knowing there was no going back. He would have to face the consequences of what his daughter had done. But more than that, he would have to face the consequences of his own failure to see the darkness creeping into her soul. And with that realization, he finally understood that some things, no matter how much you wish them away, can never be undone. As the officers continued their search, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Every creak of the floorboards, every shuffle of paper, felt like an echo in a tomb. The walls, once filled with memories, now stood silent, holding the weight of the broken man sitting in the chair. Mr. Reynolds had lost more than just his daughter. He had lost his sense of self, his hope, and his place in the world. The search went on for hours, though it felt like mere minutes to him. The officers uncovered nothing unusual, but every drawer, every room, every corner seemed to reveal the same haunting truth. The girl he had known was gone. The darkness had overtaken her, and there was nothing left but the aftermath of her actions. Mr. Reynolds couldn't escape the vision of his daughter's cold eyes, that detachment as she spoke of protection and sacrifice. He couldn't understand how someone so close to him, someone he had loved with all his heart, could become a stranger. Every conversation, every laugh, every moment they had shared now seemed like a distant dream, unreal and unreachable. After a long silence, the officers gathered their things and made their way to the door. The tall officer turned to Mr. Reynolds one last time, his voice soft but firm. "We'll continue the investigation, Mr. Reynolds," he said, his words filled with a mix of professionalism and sympathy. "But for now, you need to take care of yourself." Mr. Reynolds didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The door clicked shut behind the officers, leaving him alone in the house that no longer felt like home. He sat there for a long time, the quiet settling around him like a heavy fog. His mind drifted back to the early days, to the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the halls, to the joy she had once brought him. But now, all that was left was emptiness. The future seemed uncertain, like a dark and winding road with no end in sight. He had failed his daughter, and in doing so, had failed himself. But perhaps, in time, the truth would offer some kind of clarity, even if it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. For now, all he could do was sit in the silence and wait for whatever would come next, knowing that no matter what, nothing would ever be the same again. The officers waited in silence, their presence a constant reminder that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Mr. Reynolds felt the weight of their stares on him, pressing down like 1,000 unspoken questions. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady his breathing, to gather whatever fragments of strength he had left. But the truth, like a relentless tide, kept crashing over him. His daughter, the girl he had raised with love, hope, and dreams for a better future. She had been hiding something dark, something terrible, and now the world would know. He opened his eyes slowly, locking gazes with the officer who had spoken earlier. "I don't know what to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was different, but I never saw it." "Not really." The officer nodded, not offering comfort, but not pushing him further either. "We're not here to judge you, Mr. Reynolds," he said quietly. "We just need the facts, the truth." Mr. Reynolds swallowed hard. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, each beat like a loud, painful drum. He thought of his daughter again, her face, her eyes, the way she had stood before him earlier with such a strange calmness. She had known what she had done, and maybe, just maybe, she had never been the girl he thought she was. "She came to me," he said, his voice trembling. "She confessed, but not in the way you think. She didn't seem sorry. She said she did it for me, to protect me." The officers leaned in slightly, their interest piqued. "What do you mean, protect you?" the tall officer asked. Mr. Reynolds paused, his thoughts racing. "I don't know, she said something about keeping me safe, about making sure no one could hurt me again," he murmured. "But I didn't understand, not until it was too late." A chill swept through him as he remembered her words, her cold gaze as she spoke them. She had been so sure of herself, as if she had already accepted what she had done. "I didn't want to believe it," he continued, the words spilling out now, too fast to stop. "She was my daughter, my little girl. But she wasn't that person anymore. She became something else." The officers exchanged another look, and the taller one spoke again, his voice hard now. "Do you think she's still out there?" The question hit him like a punch. He had thought of nothing else since she had left, the emptiness gnawing at him. "I don't know," he whispered. She said she wasn't going anywhere, but his voice faltered, and he clenched his fists at his sides. I couldn't stop her. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Mr. Reynolds looked down at his hands, watching as they shook uncontrollably. He didn't know how much time passed, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the officer stood up, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to search the house, Mr. Reynolds," he said, "for evidence." A wave of nausea swept over him, but he didn't protest. He couldn't. It was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light, and he had no more lies to tell. As the officers moved to search the house, Mr. Reynolds remained where he was, staring at the floor, lost in his thoughts. He could hear them moving around him, the sound of drawers opening, the rustling of papers. But nothing seemed to matter anymore. Not the house, not the police, not the life he had once known. His daughter was gone, and in her place was a haunting emptiness that he could never fill. And the truth, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, was inescapable. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And he was the one who had failed her, failed to see the signs, failed to protect her from whatever darkness had taken root. As the officers continued their search, he sank deeper into his thoughts, the cold reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His world had shattered, and now there was no putting the pieces back together.